Retiring in 10 years from zero requires saving roughly 70% of income. Not a clever fund, not a hot sector, a number most people never even attempt. That gap matters because the wrong lever costs decades. Someone earning $70,000 who fixates on squeezing an extra 2% out of their portfolio while saving 15% of their pay is quietly signing up to work another 30 years and blaming the fund when the math was never the fund's job. Here is the uncomfortable arithmetic. If a paycheck genuinely starts at zero, one number decides whether the finish line arrives in 10 years or 40. Returns barely touch it. The choice everyone agonizes over, which index fund, 7% or 10, moves the timeline by months, not decades. So the question this whole system turns on is simple and brutal. If it truly starts at $0, what is the one number that decides between 10 years and 40? The fund everyone obsesses over is not that number, and the gap between them is where the decades hide. Years to retirement is not driven by returns. It is driven almost entirely by one thing: the percentage of income a person refuses to spend. That claim sounds wrong because the entire culture points the other direction. Financial media measures success in returns. This fund beat that fund. This year outpaced last. But the clock to retirement barely listens to returns at all. It listens to savings rate, and the two produce timelines so far apart they belong to different lives. Set the returns aside for a moment and hold everything else steady. Assume broad index funds return a real 7%. Now watch what the savings rate alone does to the finish line. Someone who saves 15% of take-home pay, roughly the standard responsible number most planners recommend, is on a path that runs somewhere near 40 years. That is the conventional working life. Retire in your mid-60s, exactly as expected. Nothing broken, nothing accelerated. Move that same person to 50% saved, and the timeline collapses to about 17 years. Same salary, same funds, same market. Half the income surrendered instead of an eighth, and the working life is cut nearly in half. Push to roughly 70% saved, and the finish line arrives in about a decade. The mechanism behind that collapse is not magic, and it is worth saying slowly because it is the hinge of the entire video. A high savings rate does two things at once, and both cut the same direction. It shrinks the life that must be funded. A person spending 30% of their income needs a far smaller nest egg to replicate that spending than someone spending 85%. And it enlarges the pile being fed into that smaller target every single month. Lower the destination, raise the speed toward it, and the years between fall off a cliff. Now hold the savings rate fixed and try to rescue the timeline with returns instead. This is the lever everyone actually pulls. Take the 70% saver and hand them a market that returns 10% instead of 7%. An enormous, historically generous difference, the kind of edge almost no ordinary investor reliably captures. The 10-year timeline shortens by roughly a year. A year. For 3 full percentage points of extra return, sustained across a decade without a single bad stretch. Compare that to what happened when the savings rate moved. 15% to 70% took 40 years down to 10, a 30-year swing. 7% to 10% return took 10 years down to 9. One lever moves the clock in decades, the other moves it in months. This is the contrast the whole culture gets backwards. The number people research obsessively, argue about in forums, and switch brokerages over, the return, is the weak lever. The number almost nobody will say out loud, because it demands giving up most of a paycheck, is the strong one. And that is the honest reason retire in 10 years reads like a fantasy. Not because the arithmetic is fake, the arithmetic is clean and repeatable. It reads like a fantasy because the required savings rate is roughly 5 times what most households attempt, and no fund choice can substitute for it. The formula has exactly one dominant variable, and it is the one that hurts, which reframes everything that comes next. If returns barely move the 10-year clock, then the broad index fund, the thing this entire promise is built around, cannot be the accelerator. It can only be the engine underneath, reliable, necessary, and almost beside the point when it comes to the years. That distinction is not wordplay. It changes what the fund is even for. If the return barely moves the 10-year clock, a fair objection lands immediately. Then why bother with index funds at all? Why not park the money somewhere simpler, or chase something with more upside, if the fund is supposedly beside the point? Take that objection seriously, because in its strongest form it is almost persuasive. If a 70% saver reaches the finish line in roughly 10 years, whether the market returns 7% or 10%, then the fund is doing so little visible work that a skeptic could reasonably ask whether it matters which vehicle holds the money. Put it in a savings account. Put it in a single stock a friend swears by. If the savings rate is the strong lever and returns barely shift the timeline, the choice of engine looks optional. That is the steelman. The fund is a rounding error, so treat it like one. Here is where the argument breaks, and it breaks on mechanism, not on a bigger number. The savings rate sets the timeline only if the money is actually growing at a real positive rate underneath it. Every calculation in the previous block assumed something specific, that the pile being fed each month compounds at roughly 7% above inflation. Strip that assumption out, and the whole system stops working. Cash in a savings account after inflation often returns close to zero in real terms. Feed a 70% savings rate into a vehicle earning nothing, and the 10-year finish line quietly slides toward 15 or more. The engine wasn't the accelerator, but remove it and the car does not move. So the fund has a job, and it is a narrow one. It provides a reliable, real return that the arithmetic can lean on. Broad index funds do this better than almost anything an ordinary investor can hold, for reasons that have nothing to do with beating the market. They are diversified across hundreds or thousands of companies, so no single failure sinks the plan. They cost almost nothing to own, so fees don't quietly eat the return the math depends on. And they require no skill, no timing, no forecasting, which matters enormously over a decade in which the saver's attention needs to be somewhere else entirely. That last point is the one that dissolves the objection completely. The single stock might outperform. It might also collapse in year 6 and destroy the timeline the savings rate built. The whole appeal of the broad index fund is that it removes the fund itself as a source of risk to the plan. It is the boring, load-bearing floor underneath the ambitious thing. Which is exactly why picking 7% or 10%, this fund or that one, is the wrong place to spend energy. Not because returns are worthless, they are the reason the money grows at all, but because once the money sits in a diversified, low-cost index fund earning a normal market return, the fund has done everything it can do. It has become the engine, reliable, necessary, finished. And that reveals what should have been obvious from the arithmetic all along. If the fund's job ends the moment it's chosen well, then the 10 years of real work, the part that actually decides whether this succeeds or quietly fails, has to live somewhere else entirely. With the engine settled, the ladder can be built, and its rungs are not what most people expect. With the engine settled, the system finally has a shape, a ladder of exactly 4 rungs climbed in order because each one is worthless until the one below it holds. Start at the top of the decade and look down. Rung 1 is the target number. The size of the pile that, drawn at a sustainable rate, replaces the spending a person actually lives on, not their salary. Their spending. Someone living on $35,000 a year needs roughly 25 times that, near $875,000, to step away. The number is smaller than headlines suggest, and it is smaller precisely because the spending is low. This is the first quiet reward of a high savings rate. It shrinks the finish line before a single dollar is invested. Rung 2 is the savings rate itself, the 70% the whole system rests on. This is the rung that sets the clock. Everything established so far says the same thing from a different angle. Define the target, then commit to surrendering the share of income that reaches it in 10 years rather than 40. Nothing above this rung matters if this one is not fixed first. Rung 3 is automation. And here is a turning point most systems skip past, because it sounds like a detail and is actually the load-bearing decision. A 70% savings rate cannot survive as a monthly act of willpower. Willpower is the wrong material. It fluctuates, it negotiates, it loses to a bad week. So the rate is removed from the realm of choice entirely. The contribution leaves the account the day the paycheck arrives, before it can be seen, felt, or spent. The money is gone before the spending decision exists. Automation converts a heroic monthly sacrifice into a background fact, and that conversion is the difference between a plan that runs for 10 years and one that runs for 4. Rung 4 is fund selection, and by now its position on the ladder tells the whole story. It is last. Not because it is unimportant, but because its work is finished the moment it is done correctly. The automated contribution lands in a broad, low-cost index fund, and that is the entire instruction. There is no second decision, no quarterly review, no switching. The rung the culture treats as the whole game is the smallest rung on the ladder, placed at the top because it is climbed last and takes the least effort. Look at the two systems side by side and the contrast is stark. The conventional saver spends 90% of their attention on rung 4, researching funds, comparing returns, switching brokerages, and almost none on rung 2. The 10-year saver inverts it completely. Nearly all the weight on rungs 2 and 3, a single afternoon on rung 4, and never touches it again. Same 4 rungs. Opposite distribution of effort. Only one of those distributions reaches the finish line in a decade. If that inversion reframes where the real work lives, the like button is the quiet way to tell YouTube that more people staring at fund tickers should see it. So the loop that has run since the beginning can finally close. If the fund barely moves the timeline, what actually does the work? The savings rate does the work. Rung 2, protected and made survivable by rung 3. The fund is the floor the whole thing stands on. The rate is the thing doing the climbing. And that is where the honesty has to enter, because the ladder stands clean on paper. 4 rungs, climbed in order, arithmetic that holds. But paper does not have a year 4. Somewhere around the 4th year, the rung that looked most solid, the 70%, automated and settled, starts, quietly, to bend. The ladder holds on paper for 3 years. It usually breaks in the 4th, and it breaks in a specific, human way that no spreadsheet models. Consider a composite case, built from the pattern that recurs whenever high savings plans are studied. A software analyst, single, earning $95,000 in Denver. She runs the arithmetic exactly as the system prescribes. Target number set. Rate fixed near 70%. Contribution automated the morning each paycheck lands. Invested in a single broad index fund, Untouched. For 3 years, it works precisely as advertised. Her balance climbs faster than she believed possible, and the 10-year finish line stops feeling like a headline and starts feeling like a date on a calendar. She is, by any measure, doing everything right. Then year 4 arrives, and nothing dramatic happens. That is the point. There is no crash, no layoff, no medical emergency to blame. What happens is smaller and far more dangerous. Life simply resumes its normal weight. A lease ends, and the next apartment costs $400 more a month. A friend's wedding requires a flight and a gift. The car she deferred, replacing for 3 years, finally can't be deferred. Each expense is reasonable, each is defensible in isolation, and each one is funded by the only elastic thing in her budget, the savings rate. Because that is what a 70% rate actually is. Not a fortress, but the most flexible number she owns, the one that quietly absorbs every shock the rest of her life refuses to. Here is the emotional trap, and it is worth naming plainly. Dropping from 70% to 65% feels like nothing. She is still saving more than almost anyone she knows. She still feels disciplined, still feels ahead. The plan doesn't announce its own failure, it doesn't send a warning. The rate erodes one reasonable decision at a time, and at no single moment does she feel like she has quit. By the end of year 4, she is saving 40%, a rate most financial planners would applaud, and she has no sense of alarm at all. That is the failure the whole system turns on, and it is the one nobody warns about. Not fund selection, not a market downturn, not discipline in the dramatic sense. The step almost everyone fails is sustaining the rate through the ordinary erosion of year 4, when the plan is going well enough that the erosion feels affordable. Now the arithmetic delivers its verdict without mercy. Recall the table. 70% saved was a 10-year path. 40% saved is not, it isn't close. 40% lands somewhere near a 22-year timeline. She did not lose a few months. She did not fall behind by a rounding error. By absorbing 4 years of reasonable expenses into the one flexible number, she roughly doubled the length of her working life, and she did it without ever making a decision that felt wrong. That is the honest cost of failing this step. Not a fund that underperformed, not a market that disappointed. A savings rate that slipped from 70 to 40 across a year in which she felt, the entire time, like she was still winning. So the fantasy question finally resolves. Retire in 10 years is not a fantasy. It is a formula with exactly one variable everyone ignores, and the formula works right up until the moment that variable quietly moves. Because when the rate slips from 70 to 40, the 10-year plan doesn't fail, it becomes something else entirely. 22 years. That is what the 10-year plan quietly became the moment the rate slipped from 70% to 40. Not a delay, a different life. But the number 22 hides something worth dragging into the light, because it sounds like a failure and isn't quite one. A 22-year path from zero, funded by broad index funds, still retires a person years ahead of the conventional 40-year track. The plan didn't collapse. It repriced. The savings rate is not a switch that is either on or off. It is a dial, and every position on that dial buys a specific number of years. 70 buys 10. 50 buys about 17. 40 buys 22. 15 buys the ordinary working life almost everyone already lives. Failing the year 4 step doesn't drop a person off the ladder. It moves them to a lower rung and charges them the difference in years. This is not a modern trick, and that matters because the culture treats extreme saving as a strange internet phenomenon invented in the last 15 years. It wasn't. Consider the American cohort that came of age in the early 1940s, when household saving rates in the United States spiked past 25%, driven by wartime rationing, war bonds, and a scarcity of things to buy. An entire nation was involuntarily pushed toward a savings rate its peacetime self would never have chosen. And that forced surplus, once the war ended, seeded a wave of home purchases and financial security that defined a generation's stability. The mechanism was identical. Consumption suppressed, the difference redirected, wealth compounding on a shrunken cost of living. The 70% saver is not doing something novel. She is doing deliberately, and to a sharper degree, what circumstance once did to millions by force. The difference is that circumstance sustained it. She has to. And that is precisely why the honest system is not sold as a guarantee of 10 years, but as a dial with realistic bands. If the rate holds near 70 across the full decade, 10 years is real, and it is genuinely achievable for a specific, narrow profile. High income relative to spending, no dependence draining the elastic number, and a temperament that treats the automated contribution as untouchable. Slip to 50 across the messy middle years, and 17 is the honest answer. Slip to 40, and 22. None of these are failures of the fund. All of them are readings on the same dial. 70% or 40, which rate could you actually hold past year 4? Drop it in the comments. So the loop that has run since the first sentence can finally close. The step almost everyone fails is not fund selection, not market timing, not the dramatic test of a downturn. It is sustaining the savings rate through year 4, when the plan is succeeding well enough that eroding it feels affordable. And the cost of failing it is measured in the only currency the system deals in: years. 4 years of reasonable, defensible spending, absorbed into the one flexible number, doubled a working life. That is the whole answer. The strong lever is also the fragile one, and it fails quietly, in a season that feels like winning, which leaves the system fully assembled and fully honest. 4 rungs, one dominant variable, a dial that pays out in years, and a failure point named without flattery. Every mechanical question the video opened has now been answered. Every question except one. The arithmetic works, the ladder holds, the failure is understood. So the system is real. The only open question left is who it was ever built for. The arithmetic works, the ladder holds, and the failure is understood, which leaves only the question that decides whether any of it matters to the person watching. Does this system fit their life, or is it describing someone else's? That question deserves a straight answer, because the honest one disqualifies most people, and pretending otherwise is how these plans get sold as universal when they never were. The 10-year path has a shape, and the shape is narrow. It requires income comfortably above spending, not a modest gap, a wide one, because 70% surrendered only leaves a livable life if the remaining 30% already covered the essentials with room. It requires the absence of the things that drain the elastic number before it can be saved. No crushing debt at the starting line, no dependents whose needs sit outside the budget, no obligation that turns the flexible number rigid. And it requires a temperament that can treat an automated contribution as untouchable across a decade in which every reasonable expense will argue for a piece of it. Read plainly, that profile is not most households. Someone earning $48,000 who supports 2 children cannot save 70% of income, and no discipline changes that arithmetic. For them, the honest reading of the dial is different and still valuable. The same system that hands a high earner 10 years hands a constrained one a move from 15% to 25%, and that move alone can pull years off a conventional timeline. The dial does not require reaching 70 to be worth turning. It only requires understanding which lever is strong. Consider the 2 viewers this video was built to separate. The first fixated on the fund, which index, 7% or 10, this broker or that, and left believing the timeline lived inside that choice. The second heard the arithmetic and understood that the fund was the floor, not the accelerator, and that every year of their working life was being priced by a single number they controlled. How much of their income they were willing to not spend. Same salary, same market, same 40 years available to either of them. Only the second one knows where to spend their effort, and that knowledge, not a ticker symbol, is what moves the clock. The application is simple to state and hard to live. Find the target number, which is smaller than the headlines, because it is built on spending, not salary. Fix the savings rate as high as an honest budget allows, 70 if the profile fits, less if it doesn't, but chosen deliberately rather than defaulted into. Automate it the day the paycheck lands, so the rate survives the year's willpower would have lost. Put it in a broad, low-cost index fund and never touch that decision again. Then defend the rate through year 4, when the plan is going well enough that eroding it feels affordable, because that season is where the decades are quietly won or surrendered. The question the whole video turned on can finally be answered without hedging. If it truly starts at 0, the one number that decides whether it takes 10 years or 40 is not the return, not the fund, not the market. It is the savings rate, the share of income a person is willing to give up. 70 buys 10 years, 15 buys 40. Everything in between is a reading on the same dial. That is the entire answer the first sentence promised. Roughly 70% saved, not a clever fund, is what turns a $0 start into a decade-long path. 70% or 40, which rate could you actually hold? That is the only question the system ever asked. This is education, not personalized advice. The clock was never set by the fund. It was set by how much income a person is willing to surrender, and that number was always theirs to choose. Wealth is built to last.